Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Tony, the Season Good Foundation, the Sisters of Charity of Cincinnati, and especially the College of Mount St. Joseph for arranging such an interesting opportunity for all of us to discuss a really important topic. I'm going to talk for 35 minutes, more or less, and then I'm interested, as you are, to hear from this great panel of folks who know and have lived far more of leadership than I ever have. But before I say anything, I want to suggest that we do a little mental experiment for about 20 seconds. Let me ask everyone here to think quietly of the names of one or two living people that you would consider to be leaders. Now, I wonder why you think of that name, or those names. So let's all take a few more seconds, and why don't we think about the qualities or behaviors or attributes that we each associate with leading well. So, who are our leaders? I'm sure people are thinking of really interesting names, political leaders, maybe a sports figure, religious leaders. I wonder who here thought of their own name. I guess nobody, or next to nobody. We are raised in a culture that prizes modesty. And modesty is a beautiful virtue, and we don't have enough modesty in any business or organization I've ever been associated with. But I want to suggest, for the next 34 minutes, that when it comes to the idea of leadership, your modesty is actually misplaced. Because it's connected to a broken idea that associates leadership only with being in charge of things. And so stereotypically, when we think of leaders, we tend to think about president, chief executive, general, and so on. And that notion of leadership is not the solution to anybody's problems. In business, politics, religious life, civic life. That notion of leadership, in fact, is part of the problem. And in some respects, the first people we need to think about as leaders are ourselves. Now, what did the leaders do to motivate the people around them? That was part 2 of our little mental experiment, and I'm sure people thought of wonderful ideas like decisiveness and honor and courage. I wonder if anybody thought of this idea enunciated by somebody with wonderful leadership credentials. He said this, quote, "You must love those you lead before you can be an effective leader." I just quoted General Eric Shinseki, who until a few years ago was Chief of Staff, highest ranking military officer in the United States. And the first time I heard that quote, it struck me as strange, coming from a military class that typically we associate with macho, being tough, or maybe not out of place. Because the more I thought about it, the more I suspect that generals make better choices. If they love the people, they must place in harm's way. And I also bet that soldiers perform more effectively if they believe they're valued in some very deep way by the people given the horrible job of sending them out possibly to face their death. So, who is a leader, and how are leaders leading? Well, we're all leading, well or poorly, all the time. And our claim to leadership is not our status, the position we hold in whatever organization we're in. Rather, our claim to leadership is who we are and the kind of values we're willing to role model in our work and life. Now, this notion certainly runs against stereotype. This is not the way we think about leaders, but this is no gimmickry or something I make up. If you look in the dictionary, one of the dictionary definitions you will find of leadership is this, quote, "The act of pointing out a way, direction, or goal, and influencing others toward it." Now, isn't it true that everybody here is doing these words all the time? We're pointing out a way by virtue of how we run meetings, who we hire, what we teach, how we study, and what we study. Many people here are parents. Could there be any more obvious example of pointing out a way and influencing others than what parents do for children over a lifetime? So by the dictionary definition, not some gimmick of mine, good parenting is good leadership. But though all of us are leading, most of us are doing so only subconsciously. In other words, we don't think about ourselves as leaders. And in order to get better at it, to be more effective as with anything else, the first thing we need to do is get a little more explicit, a little more conscious. First of all, accept the fact that we have a leadership opportunity and responsibility, and then decide what do we want to do with this opportunity we all have. And that's exactly what we're about this evening. Thanks to the College of Mount St. Joseph, reflecting a little bit on what it might mean to lead and what it takes to lead well in this environment we're in. And developing good leaders is not an abstract aspiration in this college. It's fundamentally what this college is about. Here's what the college tells visitors to the website, quote, "Our goals are to assist students in becoming leaders in their professions and in their communities." Now, I'm not going to offer a formula for doing this. I don't think a formula exists. But I do want to offer some ideas about leadership drawn from two pieces of my own past. As you heard from Dan, I was a Jesuit seminarian for half a dozen years, and then worked at J.P. Morgan for about 17 years. The shorter version of my bio would be that for about a half dozen years I struggled successfully to live as a celibate, and ever since then I've been struggling, not so successfully, not to be a celibate. But despite the obvious differences in mission and lifestyle between a religious order and an investment bank, isn't it true that there are underlying similarities? Because all human beings and all organizations have to do many of the same general tasks. We have to set goals and reach them. We have to conceive ideas and sell them to other people. We have to figure out how we're going to motivate ourselves and the people around them. And it further struck me that religious orders like the Jesuits, with whom I studied, or the Sisters of Charity of Cincinnati, in whose tradition many of you here work, actually have some very interesting things to teach us about good leadership in the 21st century. Because some aspects of good leadership have profoundly spiritual dimensions. And it's precisely these aspects of leadership that are in some ways the most critical and the most extraordinarily difficult to do well in the complex 21st century. And I want to talk about three such qualities, spiritual qualities of great leaders: purpose, results, and courage, or more expansively, purpose. The willingness to pursue a purpose greater than self-interest alone. And second, results, the discipline to get results every day in a way that keeps people aligned with their ultimate purposes. And finally, as a unifying idea, courage, as the unifying underpinning of these first ideas, the strength of character to deliver on them. So, first purpose. Let me start with the struggle to embrace purpose greater than self in a culture that presses us to embrace self-interest alone. Some of us remember, and others learned in history, in the early 1960s, when Russia and the United States were racing to get a rocket to the moon first, right? And there's an anecdote, apocryphal, we don't know how true it is, that President Kennedy has a tour around the space agency, I guess to boost morale, and at a certain point he meets somebody who's cleaning up an office, and I guess to be polite, he says to the guy, "So what's your job here?" And the guy says to him, "Mr. President, I'm putting a man on the moon." Okay, I'm from New York City. We don't want any part of this gee whiz team spirit stuff. But even I know, and everyone here knows, that the teams that perform best, whether it's the Mount St. Joseph Lions, my old J.P. Morgan, the Sisters of Charity, are teams where people get over themselves and appreciate this is not all about me. But rather, I'm willing to show up here every day and invest some part of my ego, my energy, my hopes in some mission, some project, some cause that I consider bigger than me and worthy of my own allegiance. The best teams I was ever on at Morgan were teams where we did exactly this kind of thing, where we were more interested in helping each other win than watch each other fail. We didn't stab each other in the back, and we held each other very accountable to the kind of high standards that made each person and the whole team better performing. And the research is more and more validating the point of the anecdote I just told you. namely that organizations and teams perform better when they're filled with people who are willing to put the bigger cause above their own self-interest. I'm thinking, for example, of interesting research that was done at a Harvard Business School, now almost 2 decades ago, where they took 2 sample sets of companies, one set of companies that had delivered very strong financial results over time, and another set of companies that had delivered lousy results out of time. And they went into both sets and did interviews to try and understand, was there something about the corporate culture of these places that seemed to help explain why some did well and others did poorly. And of course, when they went into the poor performing companies, they wouldn't say, hey, look, you're in our sample set of lousy companies. Could you help us figure out why you're such a dog, So they go and they do these interviews, and they come up with a number of interesting observations about corporate culture, including this one. That in strong performing companies, people always tend to be thinking about someone else. So in other words, look, it's not my company, it's a shareholder's company. And we're here because we have to deliver a good return on money invested in this company. Or when it comes to customers, hey look, we're here for this customer. We have to give this guy a terrific product that suits his need. And with respect to the people on my team, okay, look, I got to figure out how to make these people as productive as possible so that they can do good work. And in crummy companies, you get exactly the opposite. People's first instinct is to think about myself. So when it's my team, it's not how do I make these folks productive, but rather how can I use these people so I can look good and get ahead. And with respect to customers, it's not how can I give this customer something terrific that she needs, but rather can I screw another dollar out of this person on this transaction. So we know that we need kind of beyond self leadership, but the dirty secret that I don't think we talk about enough in business schools and business environments is that the cultural headwinds are blowing very hard against being this kind of person. Some of you know, we're here in a college, of the fascinating study that UCLA does every year of 18-year-olds who are entering university. They interview them and ask them to rank what things are high priorities for them. They've been doing this now for about 40 years, so it's a fascinating study because you get a longitudinal trend of attitudes of 18-year-olds. And in the first years of the study, about 70% or more of 18-year-olds used to say that it was very important to them to develop a meaningful philosophy of life. And only about 30% would say that it was very important to them to become very well off financially. And in the more recent editions of the survey, these two values have exactly flipped. About 70% or more of 18-year-olds are saying it's very important to them to become well off financially, and only 30-some-odd% say they care about developing any kind of a philosophy of life. Now, I suspect that all of you who are associated with the College of Mount St. Joseph might not recognize that kind of attitude in the people who come here, and that's terrific. You select a good sample in this college. But the sample is what it is, and nor am I in any way condescending on young adults. In fact, if anyone should feel judged, it's the rest of us. They're a mirror in the culture in which we raise them. Now, this is an imperfect but meaningful indicator of a culture where young adults are strongly inclined to worry about me first when they're coming out of your colleges and universities. And guess what? The business environment that they're coming into is in many ways exacerbating exactly this kind of problem. Let me use my Morgan history as a kind of a lens into it. When I joined JP Morgan in the 1980s, the financial industry had a lot of people who were in it I was surrounded with people who had worked there for 10 years, 15 years, and many of them assumed that they were going to be at JP Morgan for their career. And as markets became much more volatile and competitive, we sort of changed during my time there that implied social contract. Our business fortunes could swing quickly and dramatically from year to year as markets did, and we didn't feel we could create an environment where people could have an expectation of working for any number of years, much less a whole career. And so, in a way, we sent out the message that, look, any of us can be caught in a downdraft. And people got the joke. So these became environments where, on the flip side, many employees began to think of themselves as free agents. They were kind of passing through and waiting for the next good opportunity that might come their way. So the research is telling us that we need organizations that are filled with organization-first people. But the reality of the environment that we're dealing with is that it's very hard to be such a person. And so we get a lot of pressure on people to behave in exactly the opposite way, to put themselves first. Whether out of fear, ambition, greed, status, whatever it may be. So how are we ever going to square this circle in ways that are going to make families and schools and companies and the country better? It strikes me that places like this college are part of the solution. I want to suggest, as one hypothesis, that this idea of purpose beyond self is not something that anybody is going to walk into JP Morgan, read on a mission statement, and decide they're going to live for. Rather, ultimately, this is a spiritual quality. I don't mean spiritual, in this case, in the sense of going to a specific church or having a specific set of doctrinal beliefs, but rather that above and beyond any particular business or organizational setting, great leaders have a humanistic, a religious, or a spiritual conviction that we're here on earth for purposes bigger than ourselves. And that what makes life important is not just winning for yourself, but contributing in some way to worthy goals and ultimately to humanity. That's a great opportunity for places like Mount St. Joseph to rise to the task of molding these kinds of leaders, people who do have this sense of spiritual purpose. And the good news is, as best I can tell, it's exactly in line with how the Mount describes its own purpose. The mission statement of this college is short, but about a quarter of it emphasizes purpose beyond self themes. You say that you want to create a community that values, quote, respect and concern for all persons and service to others. Exactly what we need. But let me leave you with this kind of challenge before I leave this first point, this idea of purpose. Are you focused explicitly enough on how to turn your students into such leaders? Are your students challenged and even forced to reflect in very deep ways about questions of meaning and purpose? What matters? Why are you here? Not in this college, but on earth. What is your life ultimately about? Is it about comparing yourself, your salary, or your house to other people? Or is it ultimately about contributing to something? So, our first difficult leadership formation challenge to help people to become people who are worried about purpose greater than self rather than self first. And even when people begin to think this way, even when they get it, they immediately face another very difficult set of challenges, namely, how am I going to get a result? And so let's move on to a second idea now, this idea of the difficulty of trying to get results that keep you aligned with your long-term purpose. The presidential historian Robert McGregor Burns put it this way, quote, "The ultimate test of practical leadership is the realization of real intended change that meets people's enduring needs." And one of the hardest things to accomplish in 21st century organizations is to get a result, to change something, to improve something. Think again of how the organizational world has changed in the last few decades. I started my career in the early 1980s when workplaces were still quite hierarchical and siloed. That is, managers often controlled the resources that they needed to get work done. They managed the people that they needed to get tasks done. They had the information at their disposal that they needed to do work, and they didn't have a blizzard of information, and the world changed, but the world did not change very quickly. All of that is completely even powerful managers have to negotiate across multiple departments and build coalitions to get work done. They have to control resources. They have to end-run political opposition. They have to cope with constantly challenging circumstances and try to digest very complex information under lots of time pressure, avoiding the multiple daily distractions that threaten to pull people off course. When I first went to Japan and JP Morgan in the 90s, email didn't exist. Real-time decisions for us meant about 48 hours. I would send a fax to New York, go to sleep, and the next day somebody would send a fax back to me. By the time I left Japan, we exchanged 50, 100 emails a day, and were expected to be constantly in contact by cell phone. It's a very difficult environment. And once again, our spiritual traditions are giving us some very interesting tools to help us cope with it. I want to describe one such tool that comes from the Jesuit tradition. St. Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, advises us every day to take 2 or 3 little mental pit stops. So let's imagine now it's lunchtime and I have a few minutes. And so first, I want to remind myself, why am I grateful as a human being? And then second, I'm going to think about some important objective I need to be achieving these days, or some important issue that I need to pay attention to, personal or professional. And then third, I'm going to scroll through the last few hours, and I'm going to try to take away some little lesson that will help me in the next few hours. I think the genius of this very simple practice becomes very obvious when we think about its origins. The Jesuits began in the 16th century, nearly 500 years ago, and by the way, so did the tradition of the Sisters of Charity. We all associate the charities with Mother Seton, but of course part of their roots extend back to Vincent de Paul, Vincent and Louise. And when the Jesuits, St. Vincent and Louise, when these religious orders were getting started, most religious orders are what we today would call monastic in character. In other words, all the monks or sisters would go to the chapel together multiple times each day, everybody praying together. And Jesuits or charities instead helped to create a new style of being a religious order that was much more activist, where people would be in the world teaching, running hospitals as social workers, and this really wouldn't allow them all multiple times each day all to pray together. You know, we're here at College of Mount St. Joseph. How well would this place work if, you know, 3 or 4 times every day the faculty, administration, and staff simply left? Maybe better. But St. Ignatius had this great insight in the 16th century that we're forgetting in the 21st. Namely, it's very easy to dispense with a routine. Like, let's all try a little chapel together. What we cannot dispense with is the human need to get ourselves refocused, recollected, as we bob along all day on this tide of email, meeting, phone call, distraction. I get to the end of the workday, I didn't even get to my number 1 priority. I had a meeting go badly at 8:30 in the morning, and the whole rest of the day I thought, oh gee, I wish I said this at 8:30, that would have been good. And so I'm lost. Instead of being present where I'm supposed to be, I'm present in the past. So these are self-awareness problems, they're execution result problems, and our spiritual tools in our different traditions sometimes are giving us some very interesting helps to cope with them that have, of course, an underlying spiritual purpose, but often a lot of powerful execution delivery payoffs. Okay, so we've gone from the very big picture, purpose to last a lifetime. Why am I here? What is it about? To the very small picture. How am I going to make myself more productive today, the next few hours? And I want to move on to third, a kind of a summary idea to these two. Without courage, neither you nor your teams nor the students you try to educate are going to pull off this approach to leadership that I just outlined. Let me remind you what courage accomplishes. Look around this campus tomorrow on your way home this evening and think how many students have come through this place and how many students have been touched nearly a century. And now let me remind you that this college owes its existence, in a sense, to four women, four sisters of charity who came here in 1829, traveling to a region that none of them had ever visited, at the invitation of a bishop that none of them met. They knew no one. They had virtually no money. They had virtually no experience. Today, there are about 2 million people in the metro Cincinnati area. I'm afraid Dan will probably correct me, but let's say about that. Then, there were 45,000 people in all of Ohio. This was dangerous, difficult territory, yet apparently it was not dangerous and difficult enough for these women and their successors. Dozens of them, fully 1/3 of their whole religious order, volunteered as nurses in the Civil War. And when that war was ended, then groups of them started going out along the Santa Fe Trail, following the great frontier movement westward. And these women did not inherit well-established schools and hospitals. Rather, they basically started from scratch, opening the first schools and hospitals that ever existed in many parts of the United States. And when they went to start these places, they did not apply to foundations. Kathy Merchant's wonderful organization didn't exist then. They did not apply to foundations or to U.S. government for grants. They went out and they begged for money. We look at sepia-toned photographs of these women in their habits, and we think of things like cute. But these were tough women with all of the leadership qualities I've spoken about so far. They came to dangerous places because they were driven by a great sense of purpose and because they knew how to get results. They must have been terribly lonely and afraid at times, or suffered lots of doubts about what they were doing. Margaret George, who was one of the founders of the Sisters of Charity of Cincinnati, once wrote this in her diary, quote, "Never in any period of my life have I felt so completely isolated and a stranger, far from friends and from home. Her fear and loneliness doesn't teach us about weakness. It teaches us about courage." Nelson Mandela put the same kind of feeling in this way. Quote, "My greatest enemy was not those who put me or kept me in prison. It was myself. I was afraid to be who I am." Nelson Mandela, like those early Sisters of Charity, were courageous not because they were unafraid, rather because they were willing to keep going despite their fears, drawn forward by the conviction they had of their purpose. Everyone is afraid. Our challenge is not to be unafraid, but to help ourselves and our students to find the courage and perseverance to be willing to keep going. And I think part of the key to finding that courage may lie precisely in the kinds of difficulties that these early Sisters of Charity, people like Nelson Mandela and others, face in the course of life. Let me use another story to help crystallize this idea of winning courage through hardship, through difficulty. Consider the life of former U.S. Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole, who ran for president. Many of you know he was a soldier in World War II and was terribly wounded during an ambush. And so he spent months in hospitals, barely able to move. This is what he says in his biography, quote, "On good days, I could move a finger or arm a little. On bad days, I struggled to move at all. I felt imprisoned in my frozen body. I could not control my bladder or bowels." He recovered largely, but not completely. He suffered chronic pain and never recovered full use of one of his arms. And listen to how he processed his injury experience. This is my point, quote, "I came close to dying 3 times, facing death and living to tell about it. Why was I still alive? Maybe there was some bigger meaning to my life. Maybe there was something more that I was meant to do. I'm sure you hear, as I do, in the way Dole tells his story, hardship as a kind of a crucible in which not only deep purpose is forged, but also the courage and willingness to pursue deep purpose. Now, most of us are not going to suffer the way Bob Dole did, these early charities, Nelson Mandela, but everybody here has suffered, everybody here has faced difficulty. The Harvard emeritus Abraham Zelznick, who worked with a lot of corporate CEOs, made this very interesting observation once, that a disproportionate share of these people were, in his words, twice born. It's a very rich phrase, although he didn't mean it in the religious sense that we might infer. Rather, this is what he noted. How many of these people, early in their adulthood, had suffered some kind of a crisis. You're bankrupt, you're an alcoholic, you get fired, your family breaks up. And this experience totally knocks them down, and it makes them think, who the heck am I and what do I want out of my life? And his thesis as a psychologist is that it was exactly that experience that explained their ultimate long-term success, because it gave them a very deep sense of what they wanted to be their life, what they wanted their life to be about, and the kind of drive to stay with it over time. I want to draw some implications of this. If we looked at the early Jesuits, the Sisters of Charity in Cincinnati, and the beginnings of Mount St. Joseph College, we surely would have predicted failure for all of these institutions. In no cases did they have a lot of connections, did they have money, they didn't even have plans for what they were doing. And I suspect that if we went around this room and started looking at the personal histories of people here, we would have predicted failure for a lot of people here too. There are people in this room who come from terrible neighborhoods where the schools were no good, who grew up in very difficult family circumstances, who are poor, who've had substance abuse problems in their own lives or in their families, who have failed at things, who have found it very hard to fit into this city or this college or somewhere else. And modern American culture, in a way, is conveying that we should be ashamed of these kind of things and hide them. These are the anchors around our feet. But based on the anecdotes and research I'm talking about, I want to suggest almost completely the opposite. Despite whatever challenges we've had, whatever difficulties, you're still here. And maybe, instead of trying to push these difficulties away, we ought to mind them a little bit. To try to understand what inner resilience, drive, sense of greater purpose has helped you to survive and thrive so far. What do these moments teach you about your life and what you want it to be about? What courage or inner resilience did you find in difficult moments, and how do you want to tap it for the rest of your life? Let me just conclude very briefly. So I hope you take away a fundamentally different concept about what it means to lead. We all tend to associate leadership with status, position we hold on an organization chart. And certainly status can give us a wonderful platform to project leadership. But leadership is not status. Rather, it's who you are and what you're going to stand for. And so in order to lead better, maybe we all need to spend a little more time reflecting on ourselves. And a little less time, watching movies about General Patton or watching Jack Welch on television. At the beginning of the talk, we played this little mental game, and we all thought about the names of one or two leaders. So now I'm finished. But I remind us of that game. And I hope that everybody will please think of your own name first when I say we need smart, virtuous, dedicated people who are willing to suck it up and role model some very different ways of what it means to lead in a culture that really needs different and good kinds of leadership in business and government, philanthropy, and religious life. So let me end by wishing you the best of luck, especially those of you here at the college, Mount St. Joseph, as you continue to transform talented men and women into exactly the sort of extraordinary leaders we really desperately need today. That is men and women of great purpose, who know how to get results, and who have the courage to keep pursuing.